Chapter 20 of Sedition, Part 3.
Countess Rarity, you stand accused of sedition against the state of Friesland, attempting to incite an unsanctioned general strike, and as an accessory to the terrorist attacks on Old West Fort. Do you understand these charges?
3 judges frowned down at Rarity from atop a behemoth of polished wood, each one outfitted in crisp blue coats, weighed down by their personal collections of medals and decorated in elaborately spun gold epaulettes. 2 lines of blue coats, Captain Piaf at the head of one, stood against the walls, the barrels of their rifles gleaming in the sunlight that filtered through the windows. Behind her, she knew, separated from the open space in which she stood by an iron railing, an audience of curious commoners whispered anxiously among themselves. But she didn't dare look back. She gulped.
They're accusing me of being party to that despicable attack as well? Are there any other charges you wanted to add on?
The older mare sitting in the center of the judge's bench narrowed her eyes.
If you are found guilty, the penalty for each one of these crimes would be at minimum 10 years imprisonment, and at maximum 30. However, during wartime, each of these charges expose you to a death sentence. You will also address me as Colonel, Your Honor, or Ma'am for the duration of this hearing. Do you understand? Death?
A chill ran down Rarity's spine, but she refused to look away.
I understand, ma'am. You are entitled to appoint a pony educated in law to speak for you during this trial. If you cannot find such a pony, you will be allowed to speak for yourself. What say you?
There was a murmur from the crowd behind her, but no offers of assistance. Either her supporters among the commoners were too afraid to speak up, or they simply knew nothing regarding the finer points of Friesland law. She bit her lip.
I'd like to appoint my associate, Whitehorn of Highton, to speak for me, ma'am.
The colonel nodded, her eyes darting to the crowd.
Would the named pony please step forth?
More hushed whispers, but there was no comforting sound of hoofsteps. Captain Piaf clicked her hooves together, clearing her throat.
Colonel, speak, Captain. I know this pony,
she said, keeping her eyes straight forward.
He is currently under house arrest at my residence, along with the accused's husband. Very well.
The colonel looked to the side, singling out a soldier who straightened up the instant he realized he was about to be addressed.
Ensign retrieved both ponies from the captain's homestead.
With a click of his hooves, the soldier marched out of the courtroom, and Rarity allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She'd feel much better once she had some friends at her side, and even if Whitehorn wasn't a lawyer, she thought it likely that he would have at least some better idea of Friesland's legal system as compared to her. The colonel leaned back, glanced at the 2 stallions seated to either side of her, and thumped her hoof against the wood beneath it.
Countess, how do you plead?
Rarity blinked. She stole a glance back towards the crowd, for a moment thinking she had somehow dozed off and missed the arrival of Whitehorn and Pontius, but they were nowhere to be seen.
I'd like to wait for my legal counsel to arrive before I answer any more questions, ma'am.
The colonel's lip curled back into a disdainful snarl.
To be frank, Countess, this court will not abide any attempts on your part to delay or prolong this hearing. The city is in a state of emergency, and the fact that this hearing even needs to happen is an insult to myself, Governor Rhea, and to Friesland itself. Make your plea or the court will decide for you.
Rarity balked. A few angry shouts sounded out from behind her, but they were silenced by a smoldering glare from the colonel. For the first time, it occurred to her that the ponies overseeing her hearing may have already made up their mind as to her guilt, or worse, didn't even care. She shook herself, unable to keep the hard edge out of her voice.
I plead not guilty, of course. Your plea is noted. The court will now...
The colonel paused, looking towards one of the windows with her muzzle still open. Anxious whispers filled the room as more and more eyes turned to the window, and soon Rarity found herself following suit. A thick column of smoke was spiraling ever higher in the distance from the eastern edge of the city. It was joined by two more a second later, the wide black clouds painting ugly scars across the sky. Airships floated between them, throwing bombs down into the city, and gasps of alarm passed over the crowd as one began to list to the side, gradually catching a flame, and drifted below the bulk of the wall.
What's going on?
Rarity looked to Piaf, but saw her own confusion reflected back at her. The chatter grew louder, more anxious, and she saw some of the soldiers standing along the wall straightening up, fidgeting with their wings or rolling their shoulders, as if to ensure their rifles were still there.
Draw the curtains!
The colonel barked, pounding her hoof. Bluecoats rushed to comply, pulling the curtains shut and leaving the courtroom in the dim, flickering light of its chandeliers. Rarity jumped at the sudden slam of a door opening.
Make way! Step aside, quickly!
She looked back and saw a sweaty bluecoat mare shoving a path through the stunned crowd. Her uniform was dirty and wrinkled, and her coat smelled of gunpowder. After a moment of confusion, Rarity realized she recognized the pony. Lieutenant Rolker, the cantankerous mare that had first greeted her and her party as they approached Friesland under a white flag. Piaf's sister. The colonel stood up sharply, glaring down at the new arrival as she shouldered her way past Rarity.
Explain this interruption at once, Lieutenant!
Rolker squinted up at the colonel before walking around the bulk of the judge's stand and climbing up to them. She leaned into the senior mayor's ear, whispering a few words. The colonel stiffened. She nodded, turned to one of the stallions seated next to her, and whispered what sounded like an order. The stallion stood without hesitation and dismounted at the judge's stand. He cast his gaze over the room, pointing to one of the lines of watching soldiers. "You all, on me." He trotted back through the crowd without looking back, the indicated troops following close behind. Rolker spared only a brief moment to glance grimly towards Piaf before following in his hoofsteps, shutting the door behind her once more. Instantly, the room burst into noise. Dozens of voices all called out for explanation, each one lost in the chaos.
Quiet! Order!
The colonel slammed her hoof against the stand, the sharp crack of its impact on the wood ringing over the room.
Silence or I'll have you all thrown out!
Rarity looked to Piaf questioningly, but Piaf stared straight ahead, stiff as a statue. But Rarity could still see the alarm in the way her nostrils flared, the way her gaze, normally wandering her surroundings in lazy sweeps, had suddenly come into sharp focus. Finally, the crowd began to settle down. The chatter still lingered as an anxious background buzz, but it was apparently quite enough for the colonel to continue the hearing.
The court will call forth its first witness, Guildmaster Marks.
A round of boos rose from the crowd, their nerves suddenly forgotten under a wave of animosity. Mr. Marks appeared from the same antechamber that Rarity had entered from, and made for a witness stand set off to one side. He regarded the crowd with a sad smile as he settled into place, though his eyes hardened when he looked to Rarity.
Order! Order, damn you!
The colonel looked to Piaf.
Captain, quiet this crowd!
Piaf stepped forwards, the other bluecoats at her sides doing the same. The audience settled down before she could take another step, and she returned to her position with a stony frown.
Master Marks?
The colonel began, leaning over her stand to address him.
Describe to the court your experiences regarding Countess Rarity's attendance within the Commoners' Guild.
Gladly, Your Honor. Mr. Marks straightened up, meeting Rarity's eyes as he spoke. The Countess began to irregularly attend guild meetings 3 days after the terrible and bloodthirsty attack on the innocent citizens of Friesland at Old Westfort. During her very first meeting, she tricked an impressionable young guild member into getting her an audience with me. She immediately began to speak of ending the war in the Baron's favor, and attempted to recruit me in her conspiracy to force the city to surrender.
Conspiracy?
Rarity echoed incredulously.
I did no such thing! Silence, Countess, or we will hold you in contempt of court!
The Colonel stomped her hoof, and Rarity bit her next words back.
Carry on, Mr. Marks.
The stallion nodded. Conspiracy, yes. I don't know what else I could call it, Your Honor. She freely admitted that Governor Rhea had already refused her plea for surrender, and wanted me to declare a general strike that would force the city to its knees during its darkest hour. She tempted me with wealth and titles, even promising me a position in the new regime if I cooperated, but I refused. Rarity pursed her lips, glaring at the stallion as she heard the mutters from the crowd behind her. How dare he tell such lies while looking her in the eye? She took a deep breath, forcing her anger down.
Stay calm, Rarity. You'll not help your case if you behave like a common ruffian.
She would wait for now. Let him spin his lies. And then she could give the truth once she was allowed to speak.
The city is lucky to have you, Master Marks,
the Colonel observed. The Pegasi scribbled furiously on their desks, recording every word.
Continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. The Countess continued to attend meetings, though she did not speak or approach me again. I did see her associating with a baronlander that had come to the city shortly before the siege began, who I suspect may have been a spy sent in advance.
Focus, Master Marks,
the Colonel warned.
We are here to discuss the Countess.
He dipped his head. Apologies, Your Honor. Upon waking yesterday morning, an aide informed me of rumors circulating regarding a supposed labor manipulation scheme between myself and the other guildmasters. The guild members confronted me on this hearsay, and Countess Rarity was in attendance as well. Though she normally brought her hoofmaiden to accompany her, on that day she had instead chosen to bring her so-called husband, a brutish Pegasus warrior from the Baronlands. I believe she had been expecting trouble. Rarity's brow hardened. The idea of anyone describing Pontius as brutish would be laughable, if not for her current situation. His nobility had certainly been helpful, however. She may have been arrested on the spot if she didn't have him there to challenge the Bluecoats. But she held her tongue, waiting patiently for her turn. As I was attempting to bring the guild hall to order so we could address the rumors, the Countess stood and challenged me. She incited the guild to strike without my permission and planted sympathizers within the crowd to help her push her agenda. It was at this point, of course, that I ordered her arrest. Mr. Marks answered Rarity's glare with a calm smile. She fled the scene, and I reported the incident to the local garrison immediately. That is all, thank you.
Thank you, Master Marks. You are dismissed.
Rarity's eyes shot wide open.
Excuse me, do I not get to question him myself, to give my own side of events?
The Colonel arched a brow, regarding Rarity with clear condescension.
Countess, your legal counsel has not arrived yet. Well, then we can wait!
Rarity stomped a hoof.
We are discussing the matter of my life, are we not? Is Friesland always so flippant with regards to ponies' lives? Watch your tone, Countess, the Colonel snapped. In fairer times, I would not be forced to do this, but this city is in the midst of a siege, and my services could be better used elsewhere than dealing with interfering baronlanders. As your counsel is not here, he regretfully cannot cross-examine the court's witness. He is dismissed. This is preposterous!
Rarity protested, spurred on by the angry mutterings from the crowd. She turned to Mr. Marks, opening her mouth to provide her side of things, only for the Colonel to cut her off.
Countess Rarity, if you cannot show this court the respect it deserves, I will have you muzzled and shackled in place!
She shouted. She turned her glare on the crowd, who had gone from muttering to loud jeers.
And if your rabble cannot do the same, then they will have to watch from the streets. Their presence here is a privilege, and I am losing patience.
Rarity grimaced, backing down as the audience quieted. Clearly, any appeal to justice would get her nowhere here. She looked around, considering attempting an escape by force, but dismissed the thought quickly. Violence would only spur the commoners into a bloody riot, and that was assuming she could overpower the 6 bluecoats standing guard. Mr. Mark stood up, dipping his head in a shallow bow. "Thank you, Your Honor." He gave Rarity one last winking smile before stepping down from the stand and disappearing back into the antechamber. Rarity could only look on as creeping dread crawled up her spine. She had cooperated with her arrest in the hopes of avoiding needless bloodshed, but now she was beginning to wonder if she had delivered herself to her would-be executioners.
The court brings forth its second witness, Captain Piaf.
Piaf clicked her hooves together in salute before stepping forwards. Rarity watched her intently as she walked across the room and took her space in the witness stand, but the other mare refused to meet her gaze.
Captain, as host to the Countess and her party, you were ordered to supervise their actions and investigate any potentially suspicious activity. I have here a report written from you in the wake of the attack on Old Westfort.
The colonel donned a pair of spectacles, glaring down at the paper in her hooves.
Summarize for the record and for the court the contents of this report.
Piaf gave a stiff nod as she stared straight ahead.
It is my suspicion that members of the baronlander delegation have been working from within the city to stir unrest and dissatisfaction with the city's leadership in hopes of forcing a surrender. However, thank you, Captain, the colonel snapped. That is all. You are dismissed.
Piaf pursed her lips, finally meeting Rarity's piercing gaze with an apologetic grimace. Rarity only glared back at her. With a sigh, Piaf stood and returned to her position against the wall. The colonel spoke quickly, as if she was rushing to finish an unpleasant chore.
Has the defense prepared any witnesses to speak?
Rarity glanced back to the crowd, searching for any sign of a familiar face. There were dozens of ponies all squeezed into the little space, standing on and around the benches so as to make more room. A mare lifted her hoof, waving it frantically.
Riverpie! I do!
Rarity finished, looking back to the judges.
I would like to call Miss Riverpie to the stand.
The colonel narrowed her eyes.
The court will recognize your witness.
A brief commotion surged through the crowd as Riverpie squeezed through its ranks. A soldier swung open a gap in the railing to allow her past, and she came up to Rarity's side with an anxious smile.
Countess, they aim to see you hang,
she whispered.
Yes, Miss Pye, I am rather getting that impression as well,
Rarity whispered back.
But if we can stall long enough for my friend Whitehorn to arrive, I might have a chance.
The colonel's hoof slapped sharply against her bench.
To the stand, mare!
River jumped, rushing to take a seat behind the witness stand. She looked back at the room with wide eyes.
What is your relationship to the Countess?
The colonel asked.
I'm her friend. Is that a Baronland accent you're speaking with?
The colonel snorted, looking to one of the judges beside her.
An entire city full of honest Frieslanders, and this mare chooses the one Baronlander in the crowd as her witness. I deserve to speak like any other pony,
River snapped, glaring up at the judge.
The Countess is an honest and kind mare, and she'd never do anything to hurt another soul, even if they'd wronged her. We are not here to discuss the Countess's character, Baronlander, the colonel said. Do you have anything to say regarding the charges brought to bear against her?
Rarity hesitated, glancing uncertainly to Rarity before pressing on.
She means no harm. She's a diplomat trying to end the war in a way that's suitable to all sides. She just wants to avoid any bloodshed. Avoid any barren bloodshed, no doubt.
The colonel shook her head, waving a dismissive hoof.
The court will not hear further testimony from a pony who is not even an honest Friesland citizen. You are dismissed. Wait!
River stood up, desperation creeping into her voice.
But I'm a member of the Commoners Guild. I've attended every meeting, including the ones the countess attended. Ask me about him, I can—
You're dismissed! The colonel roared. One of the bluecoats marched up to the witness stand, grabbing River Pie and shoving her back towards the audience as she continued to protest. Rarity could only watch, helpless, and mouth a silent thank you as her only ally was pushed back behind the railing. A distant boom rumbled through the courtroom, raising an anxious stirring from the crowd. Rarity frowned as she glanced towards one of the curtained windows.
That doesn't sound like the cannons.
We have heard enough, the colonel said, lifting a hoof. Rarity closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable sentence. She jerked at the slam of a hoof against wood, and it was only a moment later that she realized it had come from behind her, from the door, and not from the judge's stand.
Wait!
Whitehorn's breathless voice reached Rarity's ears, and she opened her eyes, looking back to see him and Pontia standing in the doorway. His vest was wrinkled and sweat-stained, as if he'd ran across the entire city in a single frantic sprint.
Whitehorn of Highton, here to speak in defense of the accused. I'm afraid you're too late, Whitehorn, the colonel said. The court was just about to pass its sentence.
Pontius shouldered his way through the whispering crowd, clearing a path for Whitehorn to cross towards the railing.
I have evidence crucial to the court's understanding of this case, and I demand the right to present it to the court for consideration. You have no right to demand anything of this court, the colonel seethed. All witnesses and evidence have already been presented. You are too late.
Piaf stepped forwards, marching closer to the railing.
What evidence? Captain, stand down.
Whitehorn reached a hoof into his saddlebags and pulled out an old scroll.
Here, read it. Captain, do not touch that scroll, the colonel warned. I'll have you court-martialed.
Piaf ignored her, reaching out and plucking the scroll from Whitehorn's hoof. She held it out before her, quickly scanning the page, eyes growing gradually wider as she reached the bottom. Rarity looked to Whitehorn, the question clear in her eyes, and received a firm nod in return. Piaf turned to face the judges, opening her mouth.
Soldiers, arrest that mare!
The colonel stood, jabbing a hoof at Piaf.
She is disobeying a direct order from a superior officer and bringing shame on her uniform.
The troops standing along the wall looked nervously between each other, neither one willing to make the first move.
It's a letter marked with the seal of Duchess Nettlekiss,
Piaf said, casting her voice over the room.
It's addressed to a pair of mercenaries named Gava and Anatomy, ordering them to bomb our granaries to ensure the city doesn't abandon her.
The room fell deathly still. Rarity blanched, shaking her head in shock.
Nettlekiss hired them? To attack her own allies?
After several seconds, the colonel spoke.
Captain, bring me that letter.
Piaf complied, her hoof steps echoing off the walls as she walked up to the judge's bench and held the letter up. The colonel snatched it up, squinting down as the two stallions seated to her sides leaned over with grim frowns. Rarity could scarcely breathe as the colonel finally looked up from the letter. She cast her gaze over the audience before finally settling on Whitehorn.
Where did you get this?
I tracked the mercenaries myself. he said, speaking with confidence. They left their room unguarded, and I found that letter within. The colonel narrowed her eyes.
This paper is still warm, as if someone had held a candle up to it to dry ink.
So you say, Your Honor. Personally, I find it suspicious that you've carried out this trial without waiting the mere minutes required for the Countess's defense to arrive to represent her. I've not been here to witness it myself, but such behavior might suggest you hold no intent of giving the Countess a fair trial. But that is mere conjecture, and should hold no place in a court of law. Whitehorn turned to face the audience, raising his voice. What we should be concerned with are facts, and the facts are as such. The attack on Old Westfort cost dozens of innocent Frieslanders their lives. And in this very room is a letter stamped with the seal of Duchess Nettlekiss, ordering 2 cold-blooded mercenaries to carry it out. The same Duchess Nettlekiss, I would remind you, whom this whole war is being fought over. Quiet! The colonel shouted. She stomped her hoof against her bench several times. Soldiers, arrest him as well! Whitehorn only spoke louder so as to be heard over the banging. Behind him, Piaf raised a hoof, signaling for the bluecoats to stay back. Meanwhile, Friesland blood is being spilt within its very borders. If you open those curtains, you will see smoke rising from the eastern quarter, where Baron sappers have breached the outer wall. The governor is willingly sacrificing the lives of valiant Friesland troops in order to protect her cousin, a mare that has betrayed this city out of her own selfish desire to keep her lands. The crowd's mutterings were already growing angry. Even the bluecoats aligned against the walls were furrowing their brows in outrage, ignoring the continued calls from the colonel for Whitehorn's arrest. Everything this city has suffered, it has suffered in the name of defending Duchess Nettlekiss! Whitehorn shouted, stomping a hoof. The crowd grew louder, almost drowning him out. The extra hours forced upon you as your sons and daughters are conscripted to garrison the walls, who could even now be dying while you sit in here watching this show trial. It is all because of her. And here we have a kind-hearted, noble mare. Whitehorn stepped to the side, gesturing towards Rarity with a hoof. A mare whom you've heard the stories about, who has shown herself willing to help you, even if it means her death, at the hooves of rulers that care more for your labor than your lives. And if you don't act now, she will pay that price. Rarity blinked, looking to Whitehorn with alarm. Just what exactly was he calling for the commoners to do? The mutterings had turned to shouts, all mixing together into a single indecipherable mess. Sunlight streamed into the dim hall once more as ponies ripped the curtains from the windows, revealing a sky filled with smoke. Someone threw a horseshoe at the judge's bench, and a few other ponies followed suit, forcing the colonel and the other judges to duck their heads.
This is a full-blown riot!
Rarity stepped up to the rail, grabbing Whitehorn's shoulder and pulling him to face her.
What are you doing? We need to stop this!
I'm applying pressure, Countess. Whitehorn grinned back at her, reaching up to squeeze her hoof. You want to force the city into surrender, yes? There are Baron troops within the walls at this very moment, and soon there will be rioters surrounding the governor's palace. Then we'll be able to negotiate from a position of power.
But ponies will be hurt!
Rarity looked to Pontius, who was watching the crowd with a guarded expression.
Pontius, darling, back me up here!
I expect my support would do little for your case here, milady, Pontius said, keeping his eyes on the crowd. The fuse has been lit. We should leave before the blast. There was a crash as one of the flung horseshoes struck a lamp hanging from the wall. It fell to the floor and shattered, the oil within splattering across one of the discarded curtains. Within seconds, the curtain was alight, and to Rarity's dismay, the ponies in the crowd actually cheered. Pontius is right, Whitehorn shouted, opening the railing and beckoning to Rarity. The chaos will only spread from here. Let's make for the governor's palace before the city tears itself apart. With a shaky nod, Rarity fell in behind Whitehorn as Pontius led the way out of the courthouse. Rioters were already streaming out into the plaza, some of them staying back only to light more fires within. Rarity's heart wrenched as she saw the white scarves wrapped around many of their necks. How could ponies do such terrible things to each other while wearing a symbol created in her honor? She didn't have time to contemplate it now. She could already see the riot was spreading as outraged commoners spread the word of Nettlekiss's betrayal. Acrid smoke spiraled across the sky to the east, warning of the invaders that had come to make the city pay for the actions of a mayor that had no care for the ponies within. Rarity yelped as a squad of bluecoats suddenly cut them off. Pontius was already flaring his wings and spreading his stance when she recognized the mayor in command. Piaf.
Countess?
The captain spoke urgently.
Where are you going?
That's no concern to you, Pontius spat back. Rarity stepped up to his side with an accusing glare.
You've been spying on us this whole time! And I do it again, certainly, because that's what my city needed from me.
Piaf stepped closer, hesitating as Pontius blocked her progress.
Countess, please. I know you only want what's best for these ponies. Friesland was built to withstand a barren siege, but it cannot face one while its own citizens threaten it from within. My city will burn if we don't stop one of these threats, so I ask again, where are you going?
Rarity gasped.
She isn't trying to stop me. She's trying to help me. To the governor's palace. We need to speak to Rhea and get her to surrender.
The soldiers flanking Piaf all shared uncertain glances, but the captain gave her a firm nod. She looked back to her troops, raising her voice.
Right then, lads, call them up around the Countess. With speed, we can keep our city in one piece.
The rioters were already converging on the governor's palace, just across the plaza from the burning courthouse. And although it would have been nearly impossible to pierce the thick mob on their own, the extra weight of a dozen bluecoats clearing a path soon saw Rarity and her companions closing in on the palace. Ponies shouted and threw rubble at the line of troops standing guard just within the walls, but the garrison stepped aside to allow Rarity and her escort through. Piaf led them inside, as the rest of the escort fell back, waving off anyone that tried to challenge them as they ran past the flower-decorated fountain in the foyer. She took them to a different part of the palace this time, ascending a set of stairs to the second floor and bringing them to a relatively plain wooden door guarded by a pair of soldiers. Halt! The guards swung their muskets down threateningly, aiming their bayonets for Piaf's throat. The governor is not taking visitors!
If the governor cares at all for her city, she'll change her mind on that!
Rarity stepped forwards, ignoring the bayonets as they adjusted towards her.
Rhea! Are you in there? Please talk to us!
The door swung open. Governor Rhea glared out at them, her pink mane and yellow coat marred with obvious signs of stress.
Countess Rarity. I see it was a mistake to allow a baronlander whore like yourself into my city.
You will address her with respect, Pontius yelled. The guards leveled their bayonets on him as he stepped forwards. She's here to help you.
Help me surrender? How kind of her.
Rhea let out a heavy sigh, stepping aside.
It pains me, but I am willing to discuss the matter.
The guards shared a quick glance before raising their muskets, and Rarity dipped her head to each of them as she walked through the doorway, Whitehorn and Pontius following. She found herself in a large, well-furnished bedroom. A heavy wooden desk sat against a wide window on the far side, looking out over the jeering crowds outside and the smoke rising up on the edge of the city. There was only one seat in front of the desk, but Rhea opted to plop down onto the bed instead.
I will admit, Countess, you are a deceptively crafty mare. I've clearly underestimated you.
Rarity frowned.
You act as if I have tricked you.
Rhea let out a bitter laugh.
Haven't you? You've crippled my city's workforce when it's needed more than ever. You've bombed my granaries, rallied the commoners to support you in court, and then used the hearing as a platform to frame my cousin for the attack. You've managed to even time it all perfectly to coincide with a breakthrough on our outer wall, to ensure my soldiers couldn't dedicate themselves fully to either threat.
She shook her head with a small smile.
It is impressive work. I applaud you. Don't you dare blame me for that attack!
Rarity snapped.
I had no hoof in it! Nor did my cousin. Well, then how do you explain the letter?
Rhea snorted.
A forgery, obviously. I don't know how you got your pretty herbs on her seal, but I know my cousin. And that attack was not her doing. But of course the rabble have no mental energy to spare on critical thinking. The entire city will be convinced the war is a sham by sunset, and there is nothing I'll be able to do.
She clenched her jaw, lip pulling back into a snarl.
I'll have no choice but to surrender my city to you brutes.
Rarity's frown deepened.
So, Gentillesse wasn't behind the bombing after all? But then, who could have ordered it? And why would they frame her when I was just about to take the blame?
Whitehorn stepped forwards. So you understand your situation. Delaying will only cause more damage to the city.
Will it?
Rhea slid off her bed, stalking up to the window and looking out at the chaos outside.
I know how the barons feel about us. They'll tear this city apart, split it up between themselves into little counties and baronies, and destroy everything that we've worked generations to accomplish. And that's assuming they don't spend so long fighting over who gets what the entire city isn't burnt to ashes.
She turned to face them once more.
Maybe it would be better to die fighting and burn the city before they can take it from us. It doesn't have to be that way,
Rarity said, shaking her head.
Please, darling, believe me when I say that I want the best outcome for both sides. I want to end this silly little feud between you and the barons and make life better for every pony on Alta Lucia. Life was already getting better for Friesland until you showed up,
Rhea said.
We finally had the advantage on the barons. It was just a matter of time before they were forced to bend the knee, and the whole island could be united under a single civilized flag. No more petty rivalries or wars. With all this land, we could have outgrown Highton, Baltimore, even Harvest.
Pontius let out a frustrated growl. What does it matter who bends the knee? Your ponies are dying out there, and you can stop it right now.
Please, Rhea.
Rarity reached out to grab Rhea's hoof, emboldened when she didn't immediately draw it back.
I came to this land hoping to make life better for all ponies. To make Equestria more like it was when the princesses were still alive. I know you don't trust me, but I mean it when I say I can bring this conflict to a just resolution. I will fight the barons to my last breath to ensure that you and your ponies are treated fairly.
She does mean it too, Whitehorn added. This mare is relentless, though I expect you have some idea of that yourself by now. Rhea grimaced, glancing to Whitehorn before meeting Rarity's pleading gaze. Rarity offered her a tentative smile.
Please, let us bring this violence to an end.
After a long moment, Rhea let out a tired sigh.
I suppose it doesn't really matter if I trust you or not, does it? The city is lost to me either way. Letting it burn out of sheer spite is the kind of thing a baronlander would do.
She pursed her lips, lowering her head.
The city is in your hoofs.
Rarity let out a shaky sigh of relief. She'd done it. Finally, after all the setbacks, even if it hadn't been quite as bloodless as she had hoped, she had brought peace to all Lucia. She looked to Pontius, who gave her a warm smile, and then to Whitehorn, who answered with a firm nod. "You've made the right decision, Governor," he said. "Equestrians everywhere will thank you for it."